So the second video is just going to be a quick overview of how I'm taking my scan result and building a game mesh out of it. This is the scan result, and you could bake this as your high poly model, but I'm going to do a light sculpting pass on it, and I'm going to do that because I want to create some more differentiation between these big forms and the really busy piles of dust between them. So basically all I'm going to do is go in with trim brushes, and I'm going to simplify and clean up some of the larger planes and just generally reduce the visual noise on the big shapes. So in this case I'm using trim smooth border. I'll probably use a lot of trim dynamic, and I usually have a morph target stored before I start sculpting so that I can selectively undo and paint back in the original detail. But I have one that's already finished. And as you can see, this is pretty straightforward. This probably took 20-30 minutes to go over the mesh. And then from here, I'm going to build my low poly model. And to do that, I start by decimating. So I've decimated this down to 100,000 triangles. And then what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to take the smooth brush, and I'm just going to smooth out and simplify all the areas that I don't want well represented in the low. So all these tiny little triangles, I'll just come in, and the goal is to get them into just sort of a simple mound. And just carefully avoid the big shapes you want to retain. And I'll go over the whole mesh this way, and then I'll decimate again, and that'll be the basis of the low. So this takes a few minutes, and when I'm done I'll have something like this. And then from here I'll export this low into max and then do manual cleanup and further optimization. So this is the finished low poly model. I've gone over it and cleaned up odd triangulation issues from the decimation, and also reduced a lot of the detail in several areas. So right now it's 5,000 triangles, which I'm fine with for my highest LOD. I've already UV'd it, so I've exported this, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of baking it. So before I can bake, I'm going to output two versions of the high poly model, and I'm going to do this so I have one I can use to mask out the edges of the rubble. So this is the primary high poly, and you can see it includes the floor. And then this is another copy where I've gone in and I've selected the bottom floor and cut it off. And that gives me this nice uneven edge that's masked. And we can use alpha test this later to blend the prop with the world around it. So if I jump into hand plane, this is the bake file. It's really simple. There's one projection group. I've made a custom cage, and in this case I'm using a custom cage instead of array offset because I have all of these details that are pressed right up against each other, all these rocks that almost touch and things like that. And then I also have some of this stuff which is pretty simplified in the low, where I need a longer array distance to get it in the projection. So the way I approach baking is I always start with an object space bake. Bake with no super sampling, so I'll just hit bake. And that was quick. And then I'll jump into max, and I'll look at the bake on my object in max. So I like to use object space for this because you won't get distracted by things like gradients or other things that an artist might see and think is a problem when it's actually not. And I think object space also gives you a better impression of how the projection looks. So this is all sorted out already. If I hadn't made a cage yet, I would be seeing some errors, and I'd be tweaking the cage and rebaking, and it's a pretty quick process because this map only took 7 seconds to bake. But once I've reached this point where I'm happy with the projection and I know I'm not going to need to fix any more projection issues, I'll jump back into hand plane. I'll output all of the maps I know I want to use, except for ambient occlusion, which I'll do separately. And then I'll turn the super sampling up to 16, and then I'll bake that. So in this case, this will probably take 45 seconds. Now there are still 2 more maps I need to bake. I need to bake ambient occlusion, and I need to bake that mask with the alternate high poly. So first for the AO, I'm going to turn off the other maps. I'll turn super sampling off, and this will just be a test bake. I'll set a low number of samples, say 10, and then I'll run that bake out, and I'll just get a look at the AO radius to see if it's set right. And I've already set it how I know I want it, but if this was a new project, I bake that out, and this will take about a minute. So this is the test AO. It's noisy, as you can see, because it's just a test bake, but we get a good sense for how the radius is set, and I like this radius. So from here I'll bake the final quality ambient occlusion map, and to do that I'm going to set hand plane to 8x super sample, and I'm going to use 30 samples. And with hand plane AO sampling, you have to multiply the super sample factor by the number of samples. So every pixel right now is getting 30 times 8. If you use 16, 30 becomes a huge number. So you have to be conscious of how you're trading samples for super sampling. Also, I would suggest if you usually bake a higher dimension than your final texture for AO that you don't do that, because you exponentially increase the render time. So here at 40 radius and 30 samples at 8x super sample, this map will probably take 5, maybe 6 minutes. And I can hit bake on this, but I've already got one finished. And if I load the finished one up in Max, it looks like this. Now the last map I need to bake is the mask for the edges of the Rubble. And to do that, I'm going to pop back into hand plane, and in the high poly models tab, I'm going to get rid of my existing high poly and replace it with the masked high poly. And then I'm going to set the material ID output. And in this case, I don't have any materials defined, but the default material is white in color. So if I bake this, I'll get a good mask for my transparency. So back in Max, if I load that up, it looks like this. I'll just use this as a starting point and clean up some of these little splatters and make it a little bit simpler. At this point, all the baking is done, so the last step is just to make materials, and you could use Substance or Photoshop or Quixel or whatever you're comfortable with. In this case, I just made a really simple Substance material. I'm not really going to go into depth on it. It's just some gray colors, some brown colors, masking by AO, and masking by cavity. So I've loaded up Substance Painter, and this is the set of bakes, and I think it looks pretty good. And lastly, I can turn on my simple material, and this is a finished Rubble prop. And the thing I like about this workflow is that I can get one of these done in a day or two, especially if I do the scans at the end of the day and let them process when I'm not working. Whereas if I did this by hand, this would probably be a week-long prop.